an authentic narrative of a haunted house by J.Sheridan Le Fanu and read by Christopher Holton. The editor of the university magazine submits the following very remarkable statement, with every detail of which he has been for some years acquainted, upon the ground that it affords the most authentic and ample relation of a series of marvellous phenomena, in no wise connected with what is technically termed spiritualism, which he has anywhere met with. All the persons, and there are many of them living, upon whose separate evidence some parts, and upon whose united testimony others of this most singular recital depend, are in their several walks of life respectable, and such as would in any matter of judicial investigation be deemed wholly unexceptionable witnesses. There is not an incident here recorded which would not have been distinctly deposed to on oath had any necessity existed, by the persons who severally, and some of them in great fear, related their own distinct experiences. The editor begs most pointedly to meet in Lamina the suspicion that he is elaborating a trick or vouching for another ghost of Mrs. Veal. As a mere story, the narrative is valueless. Its sole claim to attention is its absolute truth. For the good faith of its relator, he pledges his own and the character of this magazine. With the editor's concurrence, the name of the watering place and some special circumstances, in no essential way bearing upon the peculiar character of the story, but which might have indicated the locality and possibly annoyed persons interested in house property, there have been suppressed by the narrator. Not the slightest liberty has been taken with the narrative, which is presented precisely in the terms in which the writer of it, who employs throughout the first person, would, if need were, fix it in the form of an affidavit. Within the last 8 years, the precise date I purposely omit, I was ordered by my physician, my health being in an unsatisfactory state, to change my residence to one upon the sea coast, and accordingly I took a house for a year in a fashionable watering place, at a moderate distance from the city in which I had previously resided, and connected with it by a railway. Winter was setting in when my removal thither was decided upon, but there was nothing whatever dismal or depressing in the change. The house I had taken was to all appearance, and in point of convenience too, quite a modern one. It formed one in a cheerful row, with small gardens in front, facing the sea, and commanding sea air and sea views in perfection. In the rear it had a coach house and stable, and between them and the house a considerable grass plot with some flower beds interposed. Our family consisted of my wife and myself with 3 children, the eldest about 9 years old, she and the next in age being girls, and the youngest between 6 and 7, a boy. To these were added 6 servants whom, although for certain reasons I decline giving their real names, I shall indicate for the sake of clearness by arbitrary ones. There was a nurse, Mrs. Sutherland, a nursery maid, Ellen Page, the cook, Mrs. Greenwood, and the housemaid, Ellen Faith, a butler whom I shall call Smith, and his son, James, about 2 and 20. We came out to take possession at about 7 o'clock in the evening. Everything was comfortable and cheery. Good fires lighted, the rooms neat and airy, and a general air of preparation and comfort, highly conducive to good spirits and pleasant anticipations. The sitting rooms were large and cheerful, and they and the bedrooms more than ordinarily lofty. The kitchen and servants' rooms, on the same level, were well and comfortably furnished, and had, like the rest of the house, an air of recent painting and fitting up, and a completely modern character, which imparted a very cheerful air of cleanliness and convenience. There had been just enough of the fuss of settling agreeably to occupy us, and to give a pleasant turn to our thoughts after we had retired to our rooms. Being an invalid, I had a small bed to myself, resigning the 4-poster to my wife. The candle was extinguished, but a night light was burning. I was coming upstairs, and she, already in bed, had just dismissed her maid, when we were both startled by a wild scream from her room. I found her in a state of the extremest agitation and terror. She insisted that she had seen an unnaturally tall figure come beside her bed and stand there. The light was too faint to enable her to define anything respecting this apparition, beyond the fact of her having most distinctly seen such a shape, colourless from the insufficiency of the light to disclose more than its dark outline. We both endeavoured to reassure her. The room once more looked so cheerful in the candlelight that we were quite uninfluenced by the contagion of her terrors. The movements and voices of the servants downstairs, still getting things into their places and completing our comfortable arrangements, had also their effect in steeling us against any such influence, and we set the whole thing down as a dream or an imperfectly seen outline of the bed curtains. When, however, we were alone, my wife reiterated, still in great agitation, her clear assertion that she had most positively seen, being at the time as completely awake as ever she was, precisely what she had described to us, and in this conviction she continued perfectly firm. A day or two after this it came out that our servants were under an apprehension that somehow or other thieves had established a secret mode of access to the lower part of the house. The butler Smith had seen an ill-looking woman in his room on the first night of our arrival, and he and other servants constantly saw for many days subsequently glimpses of a retreating figure which corresponded with that so seen by him, passing through a passage which led to a back area in which were some coal vaults. This figure was seen always in the act of retreating, its back turned, generally getting round the corner of the passage into the area in a stealthy and hurried way, and when closely followed, imperfectly seen again entering one of the coal vaults, and when pursued into it, nowhere to be found. The idea of anything supernatural in the matter had, strange to say, not yet entered the mind of any one of the servants. They had heard some stories of smugglers having secret passages into houses and using their means of access for purposes of pillage, or with a view to frighten superstitious people out of houses which they needed for their own objects, and a suspicion of similar practices here caused them extreme uneasiness. The apparent anxiety also manifested by this retreating figure to escape observation, and her always appearing to make her egress at the same point, favoured this romantic hypothesis. The men, however, made a most careful examination of the back area and of the coal vaults, with a view to discover some mode of egress, but entirely without success. On the contrary, the result was, so far as it went, subversive of the theory. Solid masonry met them on every hand. I called the man Smith up to hear from his own lips the particulars of what he had seen, and certainly his report was very curious. I give it as literally as my memory enables me. His son slept in the same room, and was sound asleep, but he lay awake as men sometimes will on a change of bed, and having many things on his mind. He was lying with his face towards the wall, but observing a light and some little stir in the room, he turned round in his bed and saw the figure of a woman, squalid and ragged in dress, her figure rather low and broad. As well as I recollect, she had something, either a cloak or shawl, on, and wore a bonnet. Her back was turned, and she appeared to be searching or rummaging for something on the floor, and without appearing to observe him, she turned in doing so towards him. The light, which was more like the intense glow of a coal as he described it, being of a deep red colour, proceeded from the hollow of a hand which she held beside her head, and he saw her perfectly distinctly. She appeared middle-aged, was deeply pitted with the smallpox, and blind of one eye. His phrase in describing her general appearance was that she was a miserable, poor-looking creature. He was under the impression that she must be the woman who had been left by the proprietor in charge of the house, and who had, that evening, after having given up the keys, remained for some little time with the female servants. He coughed, therefore, to apprise her of his presence, and turned again towards the wall. When he again looked round, she and the light were gone, and odd as was her method of lighting herself in her search, the circumstances excited neither uneasiness nor curiosity in his mind, until he discovered next morning that the woman in question had left the house long before he had gone to his bed. I examined the man very closely as to the appearance of the person who had visited him, and the result was what I have described. It struck me as an odd thing that even then, considering how prone to superstition persons in his rank of life usually are, he did not seem to suspect anything supernatural in the occurrence, and on the contrary was thoroughly persuaded that his visitant was a living person who had got into the house by some hidden entrance. On Sunday, on his return from his place of worship, he told me that when the service was ended and the congregation making their way slowly out, he saw the very woman in the crowd and kept his eye upon her for several minutes, but such was the crush that all his efforts to reach her were unavailing, and when he got into the open street, she was gone. He was quite positive as to his having distinctly seen her, however, for several minutes, and scouted the possibility of any mistake as to identity, and fully impressed with the substantial and living reality of his visitant, he was very much provoked at her having escaped him. He made inquiries also in the neighbourhood, but could procure no information, nor hear of any other persons having seen any woman corresponding with his visitant. The cook and the housemaid occupied a bedroom on the kitchen floor. It had whitewashed walls, and they were actually terrified by the appearance of the shadow of a woman passing and repassing across the side wall opposite to their beds. They suspected that this had been going on much longer than they were aware, for its presence was discovered by a sort of accident, its movements happening to take a direction in distinct contrariety to theirs. This shadow always moved upon one particular wall, returning after short intervals and causing them extreme terror. They placed the candle, as the most obvious specific, so close to the infested wall that the flame all but touched it, and believed for some time that they had effectually got rid of this annoyance. But one night, notwithstanding this arrangement of the light, the shadow returned, passing and repassing, as heretofore, upon the same wall, although their only candle was burning within an inch of it, and it was obvious that no substance capable of casting such a shadow could have interposed. And indeed, as they described it, the shadow seemed to have no sort of relation to the position of the light, and appeared, as I have said, in manifest defiance of the laws of optics. I ought to mention that the housemaid was a particularly fearless sort of person, as well as a very honest one, and her companion, the cook, a scrupulously religious woman, and both agreed in every particular in their relation of what occurred. Meanwhile, the nursery was not without its annoyances, though as yet of a comparatively trivial kind. Sometimes at night the handle of the door was turned hurriedly, as if by a person trying to come in, and at others a knocking was made at it. These sounds occurred after the children had settled to sleep, and while the nurse still remained awake. Whenever she called to know who is there, the sound ceased, but several times, and particularly at first, she was under the impression that they were caused by her mistress, who had come to see the children, and thus impressed, she had got up and opened the door, expecting to see her, but discovering only darkness, and receiving no answer to her inquiries. With respect to this nurse, I must mention that I believe no more perfectly trustworthy servant was ever employed in her capacity, and in addition to her integrity, she was remarkably gifted with sound common sense. One morning, I think about 3 or 4 weeks after our arrival, I was sitting at the parlour window which looked to the front, when I saw the little iron door which admitted into the small garden that lay between the window where I was sitting and the public road, pushed open by a woman who so exactly answered the description given by Smith of the woman who had visited his room on the night of his arrival, as instantaneously to impress me with the conviction that she must be the identical person. She was a square, short woman, dressed in soiled and tattered clothes, scarred and pitted with smallpox, and blind of an eye. She stepped hurriedly into the little enclosure and peered from a distance of a few yards into the room where I was sitting. I felt that now was the moment to clear the matter up, but there was something stealthy in the manner and look of the woman which convinced me that I must not appear to notice her until her retreat was fairly cut off. Unfortunately, I was suffering from a lame foot, and could not reach the bell as quickly as I wished. I made all the haste I could, and rang violently to bring up the servant Smith. In the short interval that intervened, I observed the woman from the window, who, having in a leisurely way and with a kind of scrutiny, looked along the front windows of the house, passed quickly out again, closing the gate after her, and followed a lady who was walking along the footpath at a quick pace, as if with the intention of begging from her. The moment the man entered, I told him, "The blind woman you described to me has this instant followed a lady in that direction. Try to overtake her." He was, if possible, more eager than I in the chase, but returned in a short time after a vain pursuit, very hot and utterly disappointed. And thereafter we saw her face no more. All this time, and up to the period of our leave in the house, which was not for 2 or 3 months later, there occurred at intervals the only phenomenon in the entire series having any resemblance to what we hear described of spiritualism. This was a knocking like a soft hammering with a wooden mallet, as it seemed in the timbers between the bedroom ceilings and the roof. It had this special peculiarity that it was always rhythmical, and, I think, invariably, the emphasis upon the last stroke. It would sound rapidly 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and sometimes 1, 2, 1, 2, and so, and this, with intervals and resumptions monotonously for hours at a time. At first this caused my wife, who was a good deal confined to her bed, much annoyance, and we sent to our neighbours to inquire if any hammering or carpentering was going on in their houses, but were informed that nothing of the sort was taking place. I have myself heard it frequently, always in the same inaccessible part of the house, and with the same monotonous emphasis. One odd thing about it was that on my wife's calling out, as she used to do when it became more than usually troublesome, "Stop that noise," it was invariably arrested for a longer or shorter time. Of course, none of these occurrences were ever mentioned in hearing of the children. They would have been, no doubt, like most children, greatly terrified had they heard anything of the matter, and known that their elders were unable to account for what was passing, and their fears would have made them wretched and troublesome. They used to play for some hours every day in the back garden, the house forming one end of this oblong enclosure, the stable and coach house the other, and 2 parallel walls of considerable height to the sides. Here, as it afforded a perfectly safe playground, they were frequently left quite to themselves, and in talking over their day's adventures, as children will, they happened to mention a woman, or rather the woman, for they had long grown familiar with her appearance, whom they used to see in the garden while they were at play. They assumed that she came in and went out at the stable door, but they never actually saw her enter or depart. They merely saw a figure, that of a very poor woman, soiled and ragged, near the stable wall, stooping over the ground, and apparently grubbing in the loose clay in search of something. She did not disturb or appear to observe them, and they left her in undisturbed possession of her nook of ground. When seen, it was always in the same spot and similarly occupied, and the description they gave of her general appearance, for they never saw her face, corresponded with that of the one-eyed woman whom Smith, and subsequently, as it seemed, I had seen. The other man, James, who looked after a mare which I had purchased for the purpose of riding exercise, had, like everyone else in the house, his little trouble to report, though it was not much. The stall in which, as the most comfortable, it was decided to place her, she peremptorily declined to enter. Though a very docile and gentle little animal, there was no getting her into it. She would snort and rear, and in fact do or suffer anything rather than set her hoof in it. He was fain, therefore, to place her in another, and on several occasions he found her there, exhibiting all the equine symptoms of extreme fear. Like the rest of us, however, this man was not troubled in the particular case with any superstitious qualms. The mare had evidently been frightened, and he was puzzled to find out how or by whom, for the stable was well secured, and had, I am nearly certain, a lock-up yard outside. One morning I was greeted with the intelligence that robbers had certainly got into the house in the night, and that one of them had actually been seen in the nursery. The witness I found was my eldest child, then, as I have said, about 9 years of age. Having awoke in the night and lain awake for some time in her bed, she heard the handle of the door turn, and a person whom she distinctly saw, for it was a light night and the window shutters unclosed, but whom she had never seen before, stepped in on tiptoe and with an appearance of great caution. He was a rather small man with a very red face. He wore an oddly cut frock coat, the collar of which stood up, and trousers, rough and wide, like those of a sailor, turned up at the ankles, and either short boots or clumsy shoes covered with mud. This man listened beside the nurse's bed, which stood next the door, as if to satisfy himself that she was sleeping soundly, and having done so for some seconds, he began to move cautiously in a diagonal line across the room to the chimney-piece, where he stood for a while, and so resumed his tiptoe walk, skirting the wall, until he reached a chest of drawers, some of which were open, and into which he looked, and began to rummage in a hurried way, as the child supposed, making search for something worth taking away. He then passed on to the window where was a dressing table, at which he also stopped, turning over the things upon it, and standing for some time at the window as if looking out, and then resuming his walk by the side wall opposite to that by which he had moved up to the window, he returned in the same way towards the nurse's bed, so as to reach it at the foot. With its side to the end wall, in which was the door, was placed the little bed in which lay my eldest child, who watched his proceedings with the extremest terror. As he drew near, she instinctively moved herself in the bed, with her head and shoulders to the wall, drawing up her feet, but he passed by without appearing to observe, or at least to care for her presence. Immediately after, the nurse turned in her bed as if about to waken, and when the child, who had drawn the clothes about her head, again ventured to peep out, the man was gone. The child had no idea of her having seen anything more formidable than a thief. With the prowling, cautious and noiseless manner of proceeding common to such marauders, the air and movements of the man whom she had seen entirely corresponded, and on hearing her perfectly distinct and consistent account, I could myself arrive at no other conclusion than that a stranger had actually got into the house. I had therefore, in the first instance, a most careful examination made to discover any traces of an entrance having been made by any window into the house. The doors had been found barred and locked as usual, but no sign of anything of the sort was discernible. I then had the various articles, plate, wearing apparel, books, etc., counted, and after having conned over and reckoned up everything, it became quite clear that nothing whatever had been removed from the house, nor was there the slightest indication of anything having been so much as disturbed there. I must here state that this child was remarkably clear, intelligent, and observant, and that her description of the man and of all that had occurred was most exact and as detailed as the want of perfect light rendered possible. I felt assured that an entrance had actually been effected into the house, though for what purpose was not easily to be conjectured. The man, Smith, was equally confident upon this point, and his theory was that the object was simply to frighten us out of the house by making us believe it haunted, and he was more than ever anxious and on the alert to discover the conspirators. It often since appeared to me odd. Every year indeed more odd, as this cumulative case of the marvellous becomes to my mind more and more inexplicable, that underlying my sense of mystery and puzzle was all along the quiet assumption that all these occurrences were one way or another referable to natural causes. I could not account for them indeed myself, but during the whole period I inhabited that house, I never once felt, though much alone, and often up very late at night, any of those tremors and thrills which everyone has at times experienced when situation and the hour are favourable. Except the cook and housemaid, who were plagued with the shadow I mentioned crossing and recrossing upon the bedroom wall, we all, without exception, experienced the same strange sense of security, and regarded these phenomena rather with a perplexed sort of interest and curiosity than with any more unpleasant sensations. The knockings which I have mentioned at the nursery door preceded generally by the sound of a step on the lobby, meanwhile continued. At that time, for my wife like myself was an invalid, 2 eminent physicians who came out occasionally by rail were attending us. These gentlemen were at first only amused, but ultimately interested, and very much puzzled by the occurrences which we described. One of them at last recommended that a candle should be kept burning upon the lobby. It was in fact a recurrence to an old woman's recipe against ghosts. Of course it might be serviceable too against impostors. At all events, seeming, as I have said, very much interested and puzzled, he advised it, and it was tried. We fancied that it was successful, for there was an interval of quiet for, I think, 3 or 4 nights. But after that, the noises, the footsteps on the lobby, the knocking at the door, and the turning of the handle recommenced in full force, notwithstanding the light upon the table outside. And these particular phenomena became only more perplexing than ever. The alarm of robbers and smugglers gradually subsided after a week or 2, but we were again to hear news from the nursery. Our second little girl, then between 7 and 8 years of age, saw in the night time, she alone being awake, a young woman with black or very dark hair, which hung loose, and with a black cloak on, standing near the middle of the floor, opposite the hearthstone and fronting the foot of her bed. She appeared quite unobservant of the children and nurse sleeping in the room. She was very pale and looked, the child said, both sorry and frightened, and with something very peculiar and terrible about her eyes, which made the child conclude that she was dead. She was looking not at but in the direction of the child's bed, and there was a dark streak across her throat like a scar with blood upon it. This figure was not motionless, but once or twice turned slowly, and without appearing to be conscious of the presence of the child or the other occupants of the room, like a person in vacancy or abstraction. There was on this occasion a nightlight burning in the chamber, and the child saw, or thought she saw, all these particulars with the most perfect distinctness. She got her head under the bedclothes, and although a good many years have passed since then, she cannot recall the spectacle without feelings of peculiar horror. One day, when the children were playing in the back garden, I asked them to point out to me the spot where they were accustomed to see the woman who occasionally showed herself as I have described, near the stable wall. There was no division of opinion as to this precise point, which they indicated in the most distinct and confident way. I suggested that perhaps something might be hidden there in the ground, and advised them digging a hole there with their little spades to try for it. Accordingly, to work they went, and by my return in the evening they had grubbed up a piece of a jawbone with several teeth in it. The bone was very much decayed and ready to crumble to pieces, but the teeth were quite sound. I could not tell whether they were human grinders, but I showed the fossil to one of the physicians I have mentioned, who came out the next evening, and he pronounced them human teeth. The same conclusion was come to a day or 2 later by the other medical man. It appears to me now, on reviewing the whole matter, almost unaccountable that with such evidence before me, I should not have got in a labourer, and had the spot effectually dug and searched. I can only say that so it was. I was quite satisfied of the moral truth of every word that had been related to me, and which I have here set down with scrupulous accuracy. But I experienced an apathy for which neither then nor afterwards did I quite know how to account. I had a vague but immovable impression that the whole affair was referable to natural agencies. It was not until some time after we had left the house, which by the by we afterwards found had had the reputation of being haunted before we had come to live in it, that on reconsideration I discovered the serious difficulty of accounting satisfactorily for all that had occurred upon ordinary principles. A great deal we might arbitrarily set down to imagination, but even in so doing there was in limine the oddity, not to say improbability, of so many different persons having nearly simultaneously suffered from different spectral and other illusions during the short period for which we had occupied that house, who never before, nor so far as we learned, afterwards were troubled by any fears or fancies of the sort. There were other things too, not to be so accounted for. The odd knockings in the roof I frequently heard myself. There were also, which I before forgot to mention, in the daytime, rappings at the doors of the sitting rooms, which constantly deceived us, and it was not till our come in was unanswered, and the hall or passage outside the door was discovered to be empty, that we learned that whatever else caused them, human hands did not. All the persons who reported having seen the different persons or appearances here described by me were just as confident of having literally and distinctly seen them as I was of having seen the hard-featured woman with the blind eye, so remarkably corresponding with Smith's description. About a week after the discovery of the teeth, which were found, I think, about 2 feet under the ground, a friend, much advanced in years, and who remembered the town in which we had now taken up our abode for a very long time, happened to pay us a visit. He good-humouredly pooh-poohed the whole thing, but at the same time was evidently curious about it. "We might construct a sort of story," said I. I am giving, of course, the substance and purport, not the exact words of our dialogue. "And assign to each of the 3 figures who appeared their respective parts in some dreadful tragedy enacted in this house. The male figure represents the murderer, the ill-looking, one-eyed woman his accomplice, who we will suppose buried the body where she is now so often seen grubbing in the earth, and where the human teeth and jawbone have so lately been disinterred, and the young woman with dishevelled tresses and black cloak, and the bloody scar across her throat, their victim. A difficulty, however, which I cannot get over, exists in the cheerfulness, the great publicity, and the evident very recent date of the house. Why, as to that, said he, the house is not modern. It and those beside it formed an old government store, altered and fitted up recently, as you see. I remember it well in my young days, 50 years ago, before the town had grown out in this direction, and a more entirely lonely spot, or one more fitted for the commission of a secret crime, could not have been imagined. I have nothing to add, for very soon after this my physician pronounced a longer stay unnecessary for my health, and we took our departure for another place of abode. I may add that although I have resided for considerable periods in many other houses, I never experienced any annoyances of a similar kind elsewhere. Neither have I made, stupid dog, you will say, any inquiries respecting either the antecedents or subsequent history of the house in which we made so disturbed a sojourn. I was content with what I knew, and have here related as clearly as I could, and I think it a very pretty puzzle as it stands. Thus ends the statement which we abandon to the ingenuity of our readers, having ourselves no satisfactory explanation to suggest, and simply repeating the assurance with which we prefaced it, namely that we can vouch for the perfect good faith and the accuracy of the narrator, E.D.U.M. The End. Home, Sweet Home by E.F.Benson and read by Christopher Holton. It was pleasant to get out of the baked train into an atmosphere that tingled with the subtle vitality of the sea, and though nothing could be duller than the general prospect of flat fields and dusty hedgerows, and the long white road that lay straight as a ruled line between them, I surmised that when it had climbed that long upward slope, there would be a new horizon altogether, grey and liquid. Eythorpe Junction was the name of the station, and though that appeared a strange misnomer, for nothing seemed to join anything, I presently perceived a weedy, derelict branch line, and a loquacious porter explained that the line to Eythorpe had long been untraversed by railway traffic. There had once been high hopes that it would develop into a popular watering place, but the public had preferred its established favourites. The affairs that led to my disembarkation on this broiling August day at a jointless junction had been conducted in my sister Marjorie's most characteristic style. Her husband, Walter Mostyn, the eminent nerve specialist, had been threatened during July with a breakdown, owing to overstrain in his work, and in obedience to the ironical ordinance of physician, heal thyself, had prescribed for himself a complete rest. His idea of resting his mind was not, as is the usual practice of those on holiday, to overtire his body, but to get away to some place where there was no temptation to do anything of the kind. There must be no golf links, or he would want to play golf, and he would prefer his retreat to be by the sea, because the very fact of being in a boat at all made him feel seasick, and he hated bathing. A rest cure in a nursing home would be horrible to him, and he thought that if Marjorie could find some deadly seaside resort, where there was nothing that could tempt him into activity of mind or body, that would do just as well. He wanted to be a beast of the field, and recover his nervous force by sheer vegetation. Marjorie, with these instructions to guide her, had thereupon set off, and scoured the coasts of Kent and Sussex, discovering on the second day of her wild career this amazing and unique Eythorpe. There was a house there to let, which she at once saw was just what she was looking for, and with that most unfeminine instinct of hers, of knowing that she had got what she wanted, and not making any further search, she went straight to the house agent at Hastings, and took the first for a month as from tomorrow. She drove back to London that evening, informed Walter what she had done, sent down her servants next morning, and took down her husband the same evening. A fortnight later she wrote to me that the cure was progressing splendidly, and that he, emerging from his languor, was getting rather cross and argumentative, which she took to be the sign of returning vitality. He was excessively bored with her, and wanted some man in the house, and had grudgingly said that I would do. So would I come soon for a couple of weeks? In fact, I must, and she would expect me on Thursday. It was Thursday now, and in consequence I was driving up the straight white road from Eythorpe Junction. We topped the rise, and there, as I had expected, was a new horizon. The sea sprang up to eye level, the ground declined steeply over a stretch of open downland dotted with furze bushes, to a line of low cliffs that fringed the shore. Along the edge of these was a huddle of red-roofed cottages, among which rose a conspicuous church tower, and presently we jolted over the level crossing of the line from Eythorpe Junction, which the public had scorned. On the left was a small abandoned station with weed-grown platform, and a board much defaced by the weather, bearing the inscription, Eythorpe and Coltham. The name Coltham stirred some remote vibration in my mind. I felt that I had heard the name before, but could not recall the reason for its faint familiarity. The road forked, the left-hand branch of it leading up the village street. The other, which we took, had a signpost with the information that Coltham was 1 mile distant. We traversed, I should have guessed, 2 or 3 furlongs, and there, close at hand, separated from the highway by a field through which led a grass-grown drive, stood a big mellow-walled farmhouse. A clump of rather fine Scotch firs at one end of it was sufficient indication of its identity. I was taken into and through a broad passage, you might call it a hall, which intersected the house, and from which a dignified staircase led to the upper story. At its further end, a glass-paned door opened into the garden, but there was no one here, and the servant supposed that they had gone strolling, perhaps down to the beach. The afternoon was still very hot, and deciding to wait for them rather than vaguely pursue, I admired the luck that had attended Marjorie's search for a tranquil sanatorium. Not a house was visible. The clean emptiness of the downland was laid like a broad green riband east and west, and in front, through a V-shaped gap, gleamed the sea. A one-storied wing, evidently a later addition, sprouted from the west end of the house. This cast just now a very welcome shade over the square space, laid with old paving stones, where long low chairs and the tea-table stood. The added wing, it is scarcely necessary to mention, was of far more antique design than the house, and looking in through its open door, which gave onto this flagged space, I found a very big pleasant room, with rafters in the ceiling and small diamond-shaped panes in the mullioned windows. The oak floor was bare but for a few rugs, and at the far end, near an open fireplace, stood a grand piano. The lid was open, and I read there, to my great surprise, the world-famous name of Barenstein, That too was just like Marjorie, to take a remote farmhouse and find a Barenstein grand, waiting for her very gifted fingers, and this fine, spacious room. How cool it was in here too, more than cool, it was positively cold. And at that moment, hearing familiar voices outside, I stepped out again onto the paved space from which I had entered. Certainly, Walter did not look as if a fortnight ago he had been on the edge of a nervous breakdown. His face was bronzed and ruddy. He strode along with a firm step and was talking in that loud, confident voice that had so often brought comfort to sufferers. "But I tell you, darling," he was saying, "that it isn't that our senses occasionally deceive us. They habitually deceive us. Ah, there he is. Welcome, my dear Ted. You have come to a place beyond the limits of the civilized world, and it has done me a world of good already. Distractions, things that interest us, are what starves the nerves. Boredom, there's the panacea for nerves. I've never been so bored in my life, and I'm a new man." Marjorie laughed. "I wonder how often you've told your patients exactly the opposite," she said. "Ted, there's a magnificent Barenstein here. Did you ever know such luck? But isn't it so, Walter? You always say that there's hope even for people who take an interest in postage stamps. Never mind. You hate being consistent, and I won't press it. What about the senses habitually deceiving us? Obvious, your eyes, for instance. If you see a house half a mile off, your eyes tell you it is about 1/4 of an inch in height. If another train passes you as yours is standing in a station, they will tell you that you are moving in the opposite direction. Smell and taste are the same. If you shut your eyes, you have no idea whether your cigarette is alight. Your sense of warmth and cold too. If you put your hand on a piece of very cold metal, it gives you the sensation of burning. I'm just as bad as you, perhaps worse, for my senses tell me that that room in there is bitterly cold today, but the thermometer says it is 65 degrees. I was suffering from some subjective disturbance, that was all, and my imbecile senses told me it was cold. There was the thermometer saying it was warm. The senses, as I tell you, are habitually deceptive. Liars. There was all his usual vehemence in this, and so I thought, a little more. He was clearly upset at this divergence of view between his senses and the thermometer. "But I'm on the side of your senses," I said. "I went in there just now, and I swear it was more than chilly." He threw a quick glance over to Marjorie before he answered. "More liars then," he said. "Another instance of the deceptiveness of the senses." He said this with the air of bringing the discussion to an end. Our talk became desultory and trivial, and before long Marjorie closed it by saying that whatever anybody else did, she intended to have a dip in the sea before dinner. Presently she appeared again with sandals and a dressing gown over her bathing suit, for there was but this strip of empty downland between the garden and the steep short descent on the beach. She insisted on my accompanying her as far as that V-shaped gap, and her very casual manner made me sure that she had some communication to make. It came as soon as we were out of earshot. "Walter's ever so much better, as you can see for yourself," she said. "Until today he has been lying fallow with the most excellent results, but now that awful activity of his mind has begun to work again, and 20 times since lunch he has alluded to that strange feeling of chill in the big room in the wing. He keeps on saying that it's subjective, but you and I know him, and that means he thinks there's something queer about it, and you felt it too, apparently." I thought I did, but then I had just come into it from the broiling air outside. But hadn't he felt it before? "No, for the simple reason that he hadn't been into the room before," said she. "When we came here, and indeed till this morning, it was locked and shuttered. The gardener, who has been caretaker here, told me that the owner had stored things in it, and that it was to be left closed. Till this morning Walter did not seem to mind whether it was shut or open, but today he told the gardener that it was all nonsense to keep the biggest room in the house shut up, and demanded the key. Denton, that's his name, talked about disobeying his owner, but Walter insisted, and he produced the key. There was nothing stored there, and I drove over to the house agents at Hastings this morning to ask if there was any such order. None at all. What does it mean?" "Nothing," said I, "except that Denton was a lazy brute and didn't want the bother of airing and dusting the room before you came, and of putting it to rights again after you'd gone. Perhaps also the owner didn't want to prohibit your playing the Great Berenstain, but hoped you wouldn't. Also, this accounts for the fact that Walter and I found the room very chilly after it had been shut up for so long. When was the house last occupied, by the way?" "I don't know. It had been unlet for some time, so the agent told me, and I didn't care in the least about its history, provided I got it for Walter now." Her jolly brown eyes made a complete circuit round my head, instead of looking at me straight when she answered. "Don't be so foolish, Marjorie," I said, "but look straight at me. You told me just now that Walter thought there was something queer about the room. What do you think?" Her eyes rested on mine. "I think there's something queer about the house," she said. "I find myself looking up suddenly from a book or a paper to see who is in the room. And I think Walter does the same. But he thinks he hears something, and then finds he hasn't, just as I think I see something, and find I haven't. I cock an eye, he cocks an ear, but don't say a word to him. He hates the idea of anything you can't account for by the ordinary functions of the senses, which he says habitually deceive you. But since that room was opened, he's been arguing with himself." "Oh, put the stopper in," said I. "Do you remember the gurgle of the hot water pipes in the nursery 30 years ago, and how you knew it was the groan of a murdered woman? You frightened me out of my wits then, but I'm too old to be frightened now. You haven't seen anything, and he hasn't heard anything. Eye hath not seen nor ear heard. Don't imagine things. Half the trouble in the world comes from imagining. Have a nice bathe and wash it all off." For a moment as she looked at me, I saw somewhere behind her eyes a sense of uneasiness, but it vanished. "I shan't wash off my gladness that you've joined us," she said, and ran off down the steep little path to the beach. I strolled back through the garden, thinking how unlike Marjorie it was to be within the grip of vague apprehension like this, or to imagine that there was anything queer about the house, for in spite of the famous episode of the gurgling pipes, she was singularly free from imagined alarms. Even more unusual, if she was right about him, was it that Walter should be affected in the same sort of way. Marjorie certainly showed her good sense in demanding that her odd apprehensions should be kept apart from his, and not be given the meeting ground of discussion. But she had noticed or imagined his, and I was soon to learn that he was not blind to hers. Walter had gone up to his room when I got back, and I went into the lately opened sitting room, where I found that my books and papers had been disposed on a big table, which was thus clearly consecrated to my use. I was engaged on a memoir which it interested me to write, though I had grave doubts about its interesting anybody else to read. The piano stood a little beyond my table, with the keyboard towards me. Between it and me on my left was the open window looking onto the garden. The room still seemed chilly, but I speedily forgot that, and indeed everything else but my delightful task. How long I had been at work I had no idea, when suddenly, even as I turned a page to carry on the note I had begun, I became vividly aware of my surroundings again, and knew with absolute conviction that I was not alone. I glanced up and saw that there was a man outside the window looking at the piano. For a second or two he gazed fixedly at it, and then, turning his head, perceived me at my table. He had not, I imagined, observed that there was anyone here, for he touched his hat and would have gone away. But I called to him. "Do you want anything?" I asked. "Denton, is it?" "Yes, sir. I was only just looking to see if the room was all right." And immediately he withdrew. But, oddly enough, I felt that it was not Denton's presence at the window that gave me the sense that there was someone here. It had nothing to do with Denton. And why, I asked myself, as the man walked briskly off, why on earth should Denton look in to see if the room was all right? It was the piano that riveted him. Did he want to be sure that all was well with the piano? I tried to attach myself to my work again, but the connection would no longer hold. There was still that sense of some presence in the room, which came between me and my page. Time and again I held my mind down to its task, but it slipped away, and presently at its bidding my eyes left the paper and scrutinized the room. Certainly there was nothing behind me, nor at my side, but I found myself, was it Denton's example which had infected me, looking at the piano as if what I sought was invisibly there. Its japanned case, darkly like black glass, reflected my table, the white keys gleamed in their ebony setting, and then I saw that some of them were moving. A group 3 or 4 at a time, and now a succession of single notes sank and recovered as if under the pressure of fingers. I cannot hope to describe the curiosity and the dismay with which this filled my mind. I gazed fascinated at this inexplicable movement, but at the same time my mind cried out in horror at the invisible cause of it. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, this fantastic spectacle ceased, but the presence was still there. Then from outside there came the sound of steps. Walter entered. "Marjorie here?" he asked. "No, was it you playing then?" "Deceptive senses," I said. "I haven't touched the piano." He looked at me a moment, puzzled. "But I would swear I heard the piano," he said. Instantly I made up my mind not to tell Walter what I had seen, and already, so fantastic was it, I was beginning to doubt if I had seen anything. Yet deep in my mind remained that intense curiosity, and deeper yet some unreasoning terror. The evening passed quite normally. Walter bewailed the hideous necessity of going into Hastings next day to have his hair cut, and the even darker fate of having the vicar of Eythorpe to dinner. It was still early when we went up to bed, and conscious of an overwhelming somnolence, I instantly fell asleep. I woke staring wide awake with the answer to the question which had slightly worried me yesterday as to why the name of the neighbouring Coltham was remotely familiar to me, clear in my mind. There had occurred there, about a year before, a very brutal murder which still remained among the unsolved mysteries of criminal history. An elderly spinster lady living with her spinster sister at some house there had been found strangled on the floor of her sitting room. It was supposed that robbery was the motive for the crime, but the murderer seemed to have heard some stir in the house and left a cash box containing £30 or £40 in the drawer he had just opened. I could remember no further details, but I thought I would stroll over to Coltham next morning and, with that appetite for the horrible which lurks in us all, find out which the house was. The two went off to Hastings next morning, and in pursuance of my plan, I strolled up the road to Coltham. It was a melancholy little bunch of cottages perched on the edge of the downs, and I had just decided that a rather stricken-looking house, with a board up to say it was to let, was a suitable site for the murder, when I saw Denton coming down the little street. "Which was the house where that murder took place last year, Denton?" I asked him. He stared at me a moment, and I saw his throat apple jerk up and down. Then he pointed to the house I had picked out. "That was the one, sir," he said. "And what was the name of the old lady?" I asked. "Miss Ellershaw," said he, and rather abruptly, much in the manner in which he had retreated from the window last night, he turned and left me. Rather pleased with myself for my perspicacity, I strolled homewards again. Marjorie and Walter, he shorn and self-respecting again, came back about 1 o'clock, and Marjorie announced her determination of writing overdue letters till the really intolerable heat of the day had declined. "Hopeless arrears," she said, "bills and bills, and the rent of the house for the next fortnight, which ought to have been paid 2 days ago. But I'll send it straight to our landlord. Or is it landlady instead of the agent? That will save a day." The clear burning of the sun had given place to an extreme sultriness. The sky was overcast with clouds which all afternoon thickened to a still density portending thunder. Marjorie retired to the piano room to perform her overdues. Walter fell asleep, and leaving him on the paved space, I joined Marjorie for coolness. She jumped up as I entered. "I was dying to be interrupted," she said, "because I long to see what's in that cupboard by the piano. I've muddled up your papers, Ted, I'm afraid. Unmuddle them again while I have an interval." She had indeed muddled my papers up. Half-finished letters and addressed envelopes and bills were mixed up with my notes. As I disentangled them, I came across a cheque she had drawn. It was made out to Miss Ellershaw. There was also a half-sheet on which Mrs. Mostyn much regretted not having sent cheque for a fortnight's rent sooner. So Miss Ellershaw was owner of the Firs, and two Miss Ellershaws, one of whom had been murdered, lived together. Had they lived in that house at Coltham, where Denton had told me the murder was committed, or had they— Marjorie interrupted these rather disquieting thoughts. "What a disappointment," she said. "Empty cupboard, all but one leaf of a book of English songs, and that's Home Sweet Home. You may laugh at it, but it's a wonderful melody. I must just play it, and then I shall get on with my jobs." The window close to which I sat commanded a view of the garden. Out of it I could see Denton plucking sweet peas. As the notes of the old-fashioned tune streamed out through the open window, I saw him drop his basket and stop his ears. Simultaneously I knew that there was some presence here in the room, not Marjorie's nor mine. She played 2 lines and stopped. She turned round and faced me. "What is there here?" she said. "And what?" Walter, whom I had left asleep, looked in at the door. "Ah, it's you playing," he said. "That's all right." By strange interweavings of emotion, that common consciousness between us all of the presence of something that came not from among the humming wheels of life, but from the grey mist that encompassed it, grew thicker in texture. There was some presence in the room, not mine, nor Marjorie's, nor Walter's, here now, though invisible, and somehow gathering strength from our recognition of its existence. In our different ways, we all contributed to it in that moment of absolute and appalling silence. Some sort of babble broke it. I babbled of the disorder of my papers. Marjorie babbled apology and promised to put them straight, if she might be allowed to deal with them. Some sort of crisis passed. I can explain it no better than that. As evening drew on, the clouds gathered even more thickly. The sea was leaden, the air dead. And when, about 10:30 that night, Mr. Bird, who had proved himself a charming guest, said good night, and I went with him to the door, we looked out onto a pit of impenetrable darkness. I saw the opportunity I wanted, and assuring him that I should really like a stroll to get such air as there was, insisted on fetching a lantern and lighting him back as far as the village. I then went straight to the point. "There was a fearful tragedy in Coltham last year," I said. "Denton pointed me out the house where the murder was committed." Mr. Bird stopped dead. "Denton pointed you out the house?" he asked. "Yes, but perhaps he was wrong," said I. "In fact, Mr. Bird, I should be very much obliged to you if you would tell me whether I am not right in thinking that the scene of the tragedy was the Firs. My sister and brother-in-law know nothing about it, and I hope they won't. But I learned accidentally today that she pays the rent to Miss Ellershaw, which I think is the name, and I hazard the guess that the precise scene was the room outside which we sat tonight." He did not reply for a moment. "I can't deny what you suggest," he said, "and my mere refusal to reply would do no good. You are quite right. Denton's telling you, by the way, that the scene was in the village itself is quite intelligible, for Miss Ellershaw, who does not intend to live in the house again, wants to let it. And if it was known that the murder took place there, it would be prejudicial. Denton knows that. And in turn, I want to ask you something. Why do you guess that particular room?" I hesitated as to whether I should tell him about the crop of strange impressions which were growing up round it, but decided not to. "There are queer things," I said. "My sister was told, for instance, that there were orders that the room should not be used. Denton told her that." "I can understand that too," he said. "The room has terrible memories for those who were in the house at the time. Any more queer things?" "None that I can think of at present," I said. "But I will wish you good night here, as the rest of your way is clear." I retraced my steps and found that Walter and Marjorie had both gone upstairs. There was a lamp still burning on the paved space where we had sat after dinner, and I went out there, disinclined to go to bed, with my nerves all strung up by the stimulus of the approaching storm, all feeling of fear about what was creeping out into the light concerning this room, and what might, I felt, suddenly burst forth with some blaze of revelation, was gone, and I was conscious only of intense curiosity as I summed up in my mind what I believed, owing to these strange hints and signals out of the mists, had actually taken place. I figured Miss Ellershaw as having been sitting at the piano when the strangling cord was slipped round her neck. I figured her as having been playing Home Sweet Home. I figured Denton as having heard her. Then there would have been silence, but for some few gasps, some quivering convulsions like the shaking of leaves in a tree, and then the discovery, perhaps by Denton, of the crime which was still unexplained. Certainly that afternoon the fragment of the tune which Marjorie had played gave him a sudden shock of horror. The night was absolutely still. Neither from inside the house nor from outside came the slightest stir of life, and the silence rang in my ears. And then, from the room close at hand, I heard, faint but distinct, the tinkle of the piano. A couple of bars of the familiar tune were played, and some voice, thin and quavering, began to sing the air. Curiosity, violent and irresistible, drowned all other feeling in my mind, and taking up the lamp, I opened the door of the room and entered. It burned brightly, and by its light, which gleamed on the keys of the piano, I could see that the room was empty. But the tune went on, softly played and faintly sung, and looking more closely at the piano, I saw that once more the keys were moving. At that the sense of fear which till then had lain coiled and quiet in my mind began to stir. But I felt absolutely powerless to go. Fear, now in swift invasion of my mind, held me where I was. Something began to form in the air by the piano, a mist, a greyness. Then in a second it solidified, and there sat with her back to me the figure of a little white-haired woman. Then the singing stopped. Her arms shot up with quivering, clutching fingers. She struggled, she turned, and I saw her face, swollen and purple, with gasping mouth and protruding eyes. Her head lolled and nodded. Her body swayed backwards and forwards, and she slid off the music stool to the ground. At that moment a blaze of light poured through the unsheltered windows, and I saw, pressed against the pane, and seemingly quite unaware of my presence, Denton's white and staring countenance. His eyes were fixed on the piano. Simultaneously with the light came an appalling crack of thunder. The storm had burst. For that moment Denton and I faced each other. The next he had gone, and I heard his feet running down the garden path. I had seen enough too, and with my mind submerged in terror, I stumbled from the room. As I paused for a moment outside, another flash flooded the gross darkness, and I saw him scudding across the down to the white edge of the cliffs. Then down came the rain, solid and hissing. My lamp was extinguished, and by the flare of the lightning, standing still between the flashes, I groped my way up to bed. All night the prodigious storm streamed and rattled, but about dawn, as I lay still sleepless and quaking with the prodigy of horror I had looked upon, it passed away, and I dozed and then slept deeply, and woke to find the morning tranquil and fresh and sunny. All the intolerable depression of the day before, not physical alone, seemed to me to have vanished. The house was wholesome as the breeze from the sea, and so too when, not without making a strong call on my courage, I entered it. I found the room where last night I had witnessed that ghastly pageantry. In no way could I account for that inward conviction, even less could I question it. All I knew was that some tragic stain had passed from it. I was down before either of the others, and strolling through the garden as I waited for them, I saw advancing along the paved walk the figure of the vicar. "A very dreadful thing has happened," he said. "Denton's body was found half an hour ago by some fishermen at the foot of the cliff down there. His head was smashed in. He must have fallen sheer onto the rocks." Now the reader may put any interpretation he pleases on the events which I have here briefly recorded, and on certain facts which may or may not seem to him to be connected with them, namely that Miss Ellershaw, the elder of the two sisters who lived together at the Firs, was found strangled on the floor by the piano in the room which juts out into the garden, that her sister, not many minutes before her body was found, had heard her singing Home Sweet Home to her own accompaniment, and that the author of the murder had never been found. It is a fact also that late on the night of which I have been speaking, I saw Denton looking in through the window of that room, and shortly afterwards running across the strip of downland towards the cliff, at the bottom of which next morning his body was found. But beyond that point we deal not with material facts but with impressions. 3 separate people fancied that there was something strange about the room. One of them found herself expecting to see some unaccountable appearance. One of them thought there was a peculiar chill in the room, and also that he heard the piano being played when nobody had touched it. The third, as I have related, believed that he both saw and heard things in that room which he cannot explain. Whether Denton shared that experience we cannot tell, nor can we tell for certain whether it was a pure accident that he fell over the cliff, or whether he had seen and heard something which drove him to make an end of himself. It remains only to add that Walter and Marjorie agreed that some strange sense, which they had both felt as of an unexplained presence in that room, had passed away from it during the night on which Denton met his death. Walter was inclined to attribute our original impressions to some purely subjective disturbance of the nerves caused by the approach of that great storm. Not then, but later, when thoroughly restored, he had gone back to his work. I told him and Marjorie what I had seen that night, and what, perhaps, Denton had seen. The end. The Rose Garden by M.R.James, and read by Christopher Holton. Mr. and Mrs. Anstruther were at breakfast in the parlour of Westfield Hall, in the county of Essex. They were arranging plans for the day. "George," said Mrs. Anstruther, "I think you had better take the car to Maldon and see if you can get any of those knitted things I was speaking about, which would do for my stall at the bazaar." "Oh, well, if you wish it, Mary, of course I can do that, but I had half arranged to play around with Geoffrey Williamson this morning. The bazaar isn't till Thursday of next week, is it?" "What has that to do with it, George? I should have thought you would have guessed that if I can't get the things I want in Maldon, I shall have to write to all manner of shops in town, and they are certain to send something quite unsuitable in price or quality the first time. If you have actually made an appointment with Mr. Williamson, you had better keep it, but I must say I think you might have let me know." "Oh, no, it wasn't really an appointment. I quite see what you mean. I'll go, and what shall you do yourself?" "Why, when the work of the house is arranged for, I must see about laying out my new rose garden. By the way, before you start for Maldon, I wish you would just take Collins to look at the place I fixed upon. You know it, of course." "Well, I'm not quite sure that I do, Mary. Is it at the upper end towards the village?" "Good gracious, no, my dear George. I thought I had made that quite clear. No, it's that small clearing just off the shrubbery path that goes towards the church." "Oh, yes, where we were saying there must have been a summer house once, the place with the old seat and the posts. But do you think there's enough sun there?" "My dear George, do allow me some common sense, and don't credit me with all your ideas about summer houses. Yes, there will be plenty of sun when we have got rid of some of those box bushes. I know what you are going to say, and I have as little wish as you to strip the place bare. All I want Collins to do is to clear away the old seats and the posts and things before I come out in an hour's time, and I hope you will manage to get off fairly soon. After luncheon, I think I shall go on with my sketch of the church, and if you please, you can go over to the links, or—" "Ah, a good idea, very good. Yes, you finish that sketch, Mary, and I should be glad of a round. I was going to say you might call on the bishop, but I suppose it is no use my making any suggestion. And now do be getting ready, or half the morning will be gone." Mr. Anstruther's face, which had shown symptoms of lengthening, shortened itself again, and he hurried from the room, and was soon heard giving orders in the passage. Mrs. Anstruther, a stately dame of some 50 summers, proceeded, after a second consideration of the morning's letters, to her housekeeping. Within a few minutes Mr. Anstruther had discovered Collins in the greenhouse, and they were on their way to the site of the projected rose garden. I do not know much about the conditions most suitable to these nurseries, but I am inclined to believe that Mrs. Anstruther, though in the habit of describing herself as a great gardener, had not been well advised in the selection of a spot for the purpose. It was a small dank clearing, bounded on one side by a path, and on the other by thick box bushes, laurels, and other evergreens. The ground was almost bare of grass and dark of aspect. Remains of rustic seats and an old and corrugated oak post somewhere near the middle of the clearing had given rise to Mr. Anstruther's conjecture that a summer house had once stood there. Clearly Collins had not been put in possession of his mistress's intentions with regard to this plot of ground, and when he learnt them from Mr. Anstruther, he displayed no enthusiasm. "Of course I could clear them seats away soon enough," he said. "They aren't no ornament to the place, Mr. Anstruther, and rotten too. Look here, sir," and he broke off a large piece. "Rotten right through. Yes, clear them away, to be sure we can do that." "And the post," said Mr. Anstruther, "that's got to go too." Collins advanced and shook the post with both hands. Then he rubbed his chin. "That's firm in the ground, that post is," he said. "That's been there a number of years, Mr. Anstruther. I doubt I shan't get that up, not quite so soon as what I can do with them seats. But your mistress specially wishes it to be got out of the way in an hour's time," said Mr. Anstruther. Collins smiled and shook his head slowly. "You'll excuse me, sir, but you feel of it for yourself. No, sir, no one can't do what's impossible to 'em, can they, sir? I could get that post up by after tea time, sir, but that'll want a lot of digging. What you require, you see, sir, if you'll excuse me naming of it, you want the soil loosening round this post here, and me and the boy, we shall take a little time doing of that. But now, these here seats," said Collins, appearing to appropriate this portion of the scheme as due to his own resourcefulness, "why, I can get the barrow round and have them cleared away in, why, less than an hour's time from now, if you'll permit of it. Only what, Collins?" "Well now, ain't for me to go against orders no more than what it is for you yourself, or anyone else." This was added somewhat hurriedly. "But if you'll pardon me, sir, this ain't the place I should have picked out for no rose garden myself. Why, look at them box and laurestinus. How they reg'lar preclude the light from—" "Ah, yes, but we've got to get rid of some of them, of course." "Oh, indeed, get rid of them. Yes, to be sure, but I beg your pardon, Mr. Anstruther. I'm sorry, Collins, but I must be getting on now. I hear the car at the door. Your mistress will explain exactly what she wishes. I'll tell her then that you can see your way to clearing away the seats at once and the post this afternoon. Good morning." Collins was left rubbing his chin. Mrs. Anstruther received the report with some discontent, but did not insist upon any change of plan. By 4 o'clock that afternoon she had dismissed her husband to his golf, had dealt faithfully with Collins and with the other duties of the day, and having sent a camp stool and umbrella to the proper spot, had just settled down to her sketch of the church as seen from the shrubbery, when a maid came hurrying down the path to report that Miss Wilkins had called. Miss Wilkins was one of the few remaining members of the family from whom the Anstruthers had bought the Westfield estate some few years back. She had been staying in the neighbourhood, and this was probably a farewell visit. "Perhaps you could ask Miss Wilkins to join me here," said Mrs. Anstruther, and soon Miss Wilkins, a person of mature years, approached. "Yes, I am leaving the Ashes tomorrow, and I shall be able to tell my brother how tremendously you have improved the place. Of course, he can't help regretting the old house just a little, as I do myself. But the garden is really delightful now." "I'm so glad you can say so. But you mustn't think we've finished our improvements. Let me show you where I mean to put a rose garden. It's close by here." The details of the project were laid before Miss Wilkins at some length, but her thoughts were evidently elsewhere. Yes, delightful, she said at last, rather absently. But do you know, Mrs. Anstruther, I'm afraid I was thinking of old times. I'm very glad to have seen just this spot again before you altered it. Frank and I had quite a romance about this place. Yes, said Mrs. Anstruther smilingly. Do tell me what it was. Something quaint and charming, I'm sure. Not so very charming, but it has always seemed to me curious. Neither of us would ever be here alone when we were children, and I'm not sure that I should care about it now in certain moods. It is one of those things that can hardly be put into words, by me at least, and that sound rather foolish if they are not properly expressed. I can tell you after a fashion what it was that gave us, well, almost a horror of the place when we were alone. It was towards the evening of one very hot autumn day, when Frank had disappeared mysteriously about the grounds, and I was looking for him to fetch him to tea, and going down this path I suddenly saw him, not hiding in the bushes as I rather expected, but sitting on the bench in the old summer house. There was a wooden summer house here, you know, up in the corner, asleep, but with such a dreadful look on his face that I really thought he must be ill or even dead. I rushed at him and shook him and told him to wake up, and wake up he did with a scream. I assure you the poor boy seemed almost beside himself with fright. He hurried me away to the house and was in a terrible state all that night, hardly sleeping. Someone had to sit up with him as far as I remember. He was better very soon, but for days I couldn't get him to say why he had been in such a condition. It came out at last that he had really been asleep and had had a very odd, disjointed sort of dream. He never saw much of what was around him, but he felt the scenes most vividly. First, he made out that he was standing in a large room with a number of people in it, and that someone was opposite to him, who was very powerful. And he was being asked questions which he felt to be very important, and whenever he answered them, someone, either the person opposite to him or someone else in the room, seemed to be, as he said, making something up against him. All the voices sounded to him very distant, but he remembered bits of the things that were said. Where were you on the 19th of October? And is this your handwriting? And so on. I can see now, of course, that he was dreaming of some trial. But we were never allowed to see the papers, and it was odd that a boy of 8 should have such a vivid idea of what went on in a court. All the time he felt, he said, the most intense anxiety and oppression and hopelessness, though I don't suppose he used such words as that to me. Then, after that, there was an interval in which he remembered being dreadfully restless and miserable, and then there came another sort of picture when he was aware that he had come out of doors on a dark raw morning with a little snow about. It was in a street, or at any rate among houses, and he felt that there were numbers and numbers of people there too, and that he was taken up some creaking wooden steps and stood on a sort of platform. But the only thing he could actually see was a small fire burning somewhere near him. Someone who had been holding his arm left hold of it and went towards this fire. And then, he said, the fright he was in was worse than at any other part of his dream, and if I had not wakened him up, he didn't know what would have become of him. A curious dream for a child to have, wasn't it? Well, so much for that. It must have been later in the year that Frank and I were here, and I was sitting in the arbour just about sunset. I noticed the sun was going down, and told Frank to run in and see if tea was ready while I finished a chapter in the book I was reading. Frank was away longer than I expected, and the light was going so fast that I had to bend over my book to make it out. All at once I became conscious that someone was whispering to me inside the arbour. The only words I could distinguish, or thought I could, were something like, "Pull, pull. I'll push you, pull." I started up in something of a fright. The voice, it was little more than a whisper, sounded so hoarse and angry, and yet as if it came from a long, long way off, just as it had done in Frank's dream. But though I was startled, I had enough courage to look round and try to make out where the sound came from. And this sounds very foolish, I know, but still it is the fact. I made sure that it was strongest when I put my ear to an old post which was part of the end of the seat. I was so certain of this that I remember making some marks on the post, as deep as I could with the scissors out of my work basket. I don't know why. I wonder, by the way, whether that isn't the very post itself. Well, yes, it might be. There are marks and scratches on it, but one can't be sure. Anyhow, it was just like that post you have there. My father got to know that both of us had had a fright in the arbour, and he went down there himself one evening after dinner, and the arbour was pulled down at very short notice. I recollect hearing my father talking about it to an old man who used to do odd jobs in the place, and the old man saying, "Don't you fear for that, sir. He's fast enough in there without no one don't take and let him out." But when I asked who it was, I could get no satisfactory answer. Possibly my father or mother might have told me more about it when I grew up, but as you know, they both died when we were still quite children. I must say it has always seemed very odd to me, and I've often asked the older people in the village whether they knew of anything strange. But either they knew nothing or they wouldn't tell me. Dear, dear, how I have been boring you with my childish remembrances. But indeed that arbour did absorb our thoughts quite remarkably for a time. You can fancy, can't you, the kind of stories that we made up for ourselves. Well, dear Mrs. Anstruther, I must be leaving you now. We shall meet in town this winter, I hope, shan't we? Etc., etc. The seats and the post were cleared away and uprooted respectively by that evening. Late summer weather is proverbially treacherous, and during dinner time Mrs. Collins sent up to ask for a little brandy because her husband had took a nasty chill, and she was afraid he would not be able to do much next day. Mrs. Anstruther's morning reflections were not wholly placid. She was sure some roughs had got into the plantation during the night. And another thing, George, the moment that Collins is about again, you must tell him to do something about the owls. I never heard anything like them, and I'm positive one came and perched somewhere just outside our window. If it had come in, I should have been out of my wits. It must have been a very large bird from its voice. Didn't you hear it? No, of course not. You were sound asleep as usual. Still, I must say, George, you don't look as if your night had done you much good. My dear, I feel as if another of the same would turn me silly. You have no idea of the dreams I had. I couldn't speak of them when I woke up, and if this room wasn't so bright and sunny, I shouldn't care to think of them even now. Well, really, George, that isn't very common with you, I must say. You must have... No, you only had what I had yesterday. Unless you had tea at that wretched clubhouse, did you? No, nothing but a cup of tea and some bread and butter. I should really like to know how I came to put my dream together, as I suppose one does put one's dreams together from a lot of little things one has been seeing or reading. Look here, Mary. It was like this, if I shan't be boring you. I wish to hear what it was, George. I will tell you when I have had enough. All right. I must tell you that it wasn't like other nightmares in one way, because I didn't really see anyone who spoke to me or touched me, and yet I was most fearfully impressed with the reality of it all. First, I was moving about in an old-fashioned sort of panelled room. I remember there was a fireplace and a lot of burnt papers in it, and I was in a great state of anxiety about something. There was someone else, a servant, I suppose, because I remember saying to him, "Horses as quick as you can," and then waiting a bit. And next I heard several people coming upstairs, and a noise like spurs on a boarded floor. And then the door opened, and whatever it was that I was expecting happened. Yes, but what was that? You see, I couldn't tell. It was the sort of shock that upsets you in a dream. You either wake up or else everything goes black. That was what happened to me. Then I was in a big dark-walled room, panelled, I think, like the other, and a number of people, and I was evidently standing your trial, I suppose, George. Goodness, yes, Mary, I was, but did you dream that too? How very odd. No, I didn't get enough sleep for that. Go on, George, and I will tell you afterwards. Yes, well, I was being tried for my life, I've no doubt, from the state I was in. I had no one speaking for me, and somewhere there was a most fearful fellow, on the bench I should have said, only that he seemed to be pitching into me most unfairly, and twisting everything I said, and asking most abominable questions. What about? Why, dates when I was at particular places, and letters I was supposed to have written, and why I had destroyed some papers. And I recollect his laughing at answers I made in a way that quite daunted me. It doesn't sound much, but I can tell you, Mary, it was really appalling at the time. I am quite certain there was such a man once, and a most horrible villain he must have been. The things he said— Thank you, I have no wish to hear them. I can go to the links any day myself. How did it end? Oh, against me, he saw to that. I do wish, Mary, I could give you a notion of the strain that came after that, and seemed to me to last for days, waiting, and sometimes writing things I knew to be enormously important to me, and waiting for answers and none coming, and after that I came out. Ah, what makes you say that? Do you know what sort of thing I saw? Was it a dark cold day and snow in the streets and a fire burning somewhere near you? By George, it was. You have had the same nightmare, really not? Well, it is the oddest thing. Yes, I've no doubt it was an execution for high treason. I know I was laid on straw and jolted along most wretchedly, and then had to go up some steps, and someone was holding my arm, and I remember seeing a bit of a ladder and hearing a sound of a lot of people. I really don't think I could bear now to go into a crowd of people and hear the noise they make talking. However, mercifully, I didn't get to the real business. The dream passed off with a sort of thunder inside my head. But Mary— I know what you're going to ask. I suppose this is an instance of a kind of thought reading. Miss Wilkins called yesterday and told me of a dream her brother had as a child when they lived here. And something did no doubt make me think of that when I was awake last night, listening to those horrible owls and those men talking and laughing in the shrubbery. By the way, I wish you would see if they have done any damage and speak to the police about it. And so, I suppose, from my brain, it must have got into yours while you were asleep. Curious, no doubt, and I am sorry it gave you such a bad night. You had better be as much in the fresh air as you can today. Oh, it's all right now, but I think I will go over to the lodge and see if I can get a game with any of them. And you? I have enough to do for this morning, and this afternoon, if I am not interrupted, there is my drawing. To be sure, I want to see that finished very much. No damage was discoverable in the shrubbery. Mr. Anstruther surveyed with faint interest the site of the rose garden, where the uprooted post still lay, and the hole it had occupied remained unfilled. Collins, upon inquiry made, proved to be better, but quite unable to come to his work. He expressed by the mouth of his wife a hope that he hadn't done nothing wrong clearing away them things. Mrs. Collins added that there was a lot of talking people in Westfield, and the Hold ones was the worst. Seemed to think everything of them, having been in the parish longer than what other people had. But as to what they said, no more could then be ascertained than that it had quite upset Collins, and was a lot of nonsense. Recruited by lunch and a brief period of slumber, Mrs. Anstruther settled herself comfortably upon her sketching chair, in the path leading through the shrubbery to the side gate of the churchyard. Trees and buildings were among her favourite subjects, and here she had good studies of both. She worked hard, and the drawing was becoming a really pleasant thing to look upon by the time that the wooded hills to the west had shut off the sun. Still she would have persevered, but the light changed rapidly, and it became obvious that the last touches must be added on the morrow. She rose and turned towards the house, pausing for a time to take delight in the limpid green western sky. Then she passed on between the dark box bushes, and at a point just before the path debouched on the lawn, she stopped once again and considered the quiet evening landscape, and made a mental note that that must be the tower of one of the roofing churches that one caught on the skyline, Then a bird, perhaps, rustled in the boxbush on her left, and she turned and started at seeing what at first she took to be a 5th of November mask peeping out among the branches. She looked closer. It was not a mask, it was a face, large, smooth and pink. She remembers the minute drops of perspiration which were starting from its forehead. She remembers how the jaws were clean-shaven and the eyes shut. She remembers also, and with an accuracy which makes the thought intolerable to her, how the mouth was open and a single tooth appeared below the upper lip. As she looked, the face receded into the darkness of the bush. The shelter of the house was gained and the door shut before she collapsed. Mr. and Mrs. Anstruther had been for a week or more recruiting at Brighton before they received a circular from the Essex Archaeological Society and a query as to whether they possessed certain historical portraits which it was desired to include in the forthcoming work on Essex portraits to be published under the Society's auspices. There was an accompanying letter from the Secretary which contained the following passage. "We are specially anxious to know whether you possess the original of the engraving of which I enclose a photograph. It represents Sir Blank, Lord Chief Justice under Charles II, who, as you doubtless know, retired after his disgrace to Westfield and is supposed to have died there of remorse. It may interest you to hear that a curious entry has recently been found in the registers, not of Westfield but of Prior's Ruthing, to the effect that the parish was so much troubled after his death that the rector of Westfield summoned the parsons of all the Ruthings to come and lay him, which they did. The entry ends by saying, 'The stake is in a field adjoining to the churchyard of Westfield on the west side.' Perhaps you can let us know if any tradition to this effect is current in your parish." The incidents which the enclosed photograph recalled were productive of a severe shock to Mrs. Anstruther. It was decided that she must spend the winter abroad. Mr. Anstruther, when he went down to Westfield to make the necessary arrangements, not unnaturally told his story to the rector, an old gentleman, who showed a little surprise. "Really, I had managed to piece out for myself very much what must have happened, partly from old people's talk and partly from what I saw in your grounds. Of course, we have suffered to some extent also. Yes, it was bad at first, like owls, as you say, and men talking sometimes. One night it was in this garden, and at other times about several of the cottages. But lately there has been very little. I think it will die out. There is nothing in our registers except the entry of the burial, and what I for a long time took to be the family motto. But last time I looked at it, I noticed that it was added in a later hand and had the initials of one of our rectors quite late in the 17th century, A.C., Augustine Crompton. Here it is, you see, quieta non movere, I suppose. Well, it is rather hard to say exactly what I do suppose." The end. The Empty House by Algernon Blackwood and read by Christopher Holton. Certain houses, like certain persons, manage somehow to proclaim at once their character for evil. In the case of the latter, no particular feature need betray them. They may boast an open countenance and an ingenuous smile, and yet a little of their company leaves the unalterable conviction that there is something radically amiss with their being, that they are evil. Willy-nilly they seem to communicate an atmosphere of secret and wicked thoughts, which makes those in their immediate neighbourhood shrink from them as from a thing diseased. And perhaps with houses the same principle is operative, and it is the aroma of evil deeds committed under a particular roof long after the actual doers have passed away, that makes the gooseflesh come and the hair rise. Something of the original passion of the evildoer and of the horror felt by his victim enters the heart of the innocent watcher, and he becomes suddenly conscious of tingling nerves, creeping skin, and a chilling of the blood. He is terror-stricken without apparent cause. There was manifestly nothing in the external appearance of this particular house to bear out the tales of the horror that was said to reign within. It was neither lonely nor unkempt. It stood crowded into a corner of the square, and looked exactly like the houses on either side of it. It had the same number of windows as its neighbours, the same balcony overlooking the gardens, the same white steps leading up to the heavy black front door. And in the rear there was the same narrow strip of green with neat box borders running up to the wall that divided it from the backs of the adjoining houses. Apparently, too, the number of chimney pots on the roof was the same, the breadth and angle of the eaves, and even the height of the dirty area railings. And yet this house in the square, that seemed precisely similar to its 50 ugly neighbours, was as a matter of fact entirely different, horribly different. Wherein lay this marked invisible difference is impossible to say. It cannot be ascribed wholly to the imagination, because persons who had spent some time in the house, knowing nothing of the facts, had declared positively that certain rooms were so disagreeable they would rather die than enter them again, and that the atmosphere of the whole house produced in them symptoms of a genuine terror, while the series of innocent tenants who had tried to live in it and been forced to decamp at the shortest possible notice was indeed little less than a scandal in the town. When Shorthouse arrived to pay a weekend visit to his Aunt Julia in her little house on the seafront at the other end of the town, he found her charged to the brim with mystery and excitement. He had only received her telegram that morning, and he had come anticipating boredom, but the moment he touched her hand and kissed her apple-skin wrinkled cheek, he caught the first wave of her electrical condition. The impression deepened when he learned that there were to be no other visitors, and that he had been telegraphed for with a very special object. Something was in the wind, and the something would doubtless bear fruit, for this elderly spinster aunt with a mania for psychical research had brains as well as willpower, and by hook or by crook, she usually managed to accomplish her ends. The revelation was made soon after tea when she sidled close up to him as they paced slowly along the seafront in the dusk. "I've got the keys," she announced in a delighted yet half-awesome voice. "Got them till Monday." "The keys of the bathing machine, or?" he asked innocently, looking from the sea to the town. Nothing brought her so quickly to the point as feigning stupidity. "Neither," she whispered. "I've got the keys of the haunted house in the square, and I'm going there tonight." Shorthouse was conscious of the slightest possible tremor down his back. He dropped his teasing tone. Something in her voice and manner thrilled him. She was in earnest. "But you can't go alone," he began. "That's why I wired for you," she said with decision. He turned to look at her. The ugly, lined, enigmatical face was alive with excitement. There was the glow of genuine enthusiasm round it like a halo. The eyes shone. He caught another wave of her excitement, and a second tremor, more marked than the first, accompanied it. "Thanks, Aunt Julia," he said politely. "Thanks awfully." "I should not dare to go quite alone," she went on, raising her voice. "But with you I should enjoy it immensely. You're afraid of nothing, I know." "Thanks so much," he said again. Is anything likely to happen?" "A great deal has happened," she whispered, "though it's been most cleverly hushed up. 3 tenants have come and gone in the last few months, and the house is said to be empty for good now." In spite of himself, Shorthouse became interested. His aunt was so very much in earnest. "The house is very old indeed," she went on, "and the story, an unpleasant one, dates a long way back. It has to do with a murder committed by a jealous stableman who had some affair with a servant in the house. One night he managed to secrete himself in the cellar, and when everyone was asleep, he crept upstairs to the servants' quarters, chased the girl down to the next landing, and before anyone could come to the rescue, threw her bodily over the banisters into the hall below. And the stableman was caught, I believe, and hanged for murder. But it all happened a century ago, and I've not been able to get more details of the story." Shorthouse now felt his interest thoroughly aroused, but though he was not particularly nervous for himself, he hesitated a little on his aunt's account. "On one condition," he said at length. "Nothing will prevent my going," she said firmly, "but I may as well hear your condition. That you guarantee your power of self-control if anything really horrible happens. I mean that you are sure you won't get too frightened." "Jim," she said scornfully, "I'm not young, I know, nor are my nerves. But with you I should be afraid of nothing in the world." This, of course, settled it, for Shorthouse had no pretensions to being other than a very ordinary young man, and an appeal to his vanity was irresistible. He agreed to go. Instinctively, by a sort of subconscious preparation, he kept himself and his forces well in hand the whole evening, compelling an accumulative reserve of control by that nameless inward process of gradually putting all the emotions away and turning the key upon them, a process difficult to describe but wonderfully effective, as all men who have lived through severe trials of the inner man well understand. Later it stood him in good stead. But it was not until 10:30, when they stood in the hall, well in the glare of friendly lamps and still surrounded by comforting human influences, that he had to make the first call upon this store of collected strength. For once the door was closed, and he saw the deserted silent street stretching away white in the moonlight before them. It came to him clearly that the real test that night would be in dealing with two fears instead of one. He would have to carry his aunt's fear as well as his own. And as he glanced down at her sphinx-like countenance and realized that it might assume no pleasant aspect in a rush of real terror, he felt satisfied with only one thing in the whole adventure, that he had confidence in his own will and power to stand against any shock that might come. Slowly they walked along the empty streets of the town. A bright autumn moon silvered the roofs, casting deep shadows. There was no breath of wind, and the trees in the formal gardens by the seafront watched them silently as they passed along. To his aunt's occasional remarks, Shorthouse made no reply, realizing that she was simply surrounding herself with mental buffers, saying ordinary things to prevent herself thinking of extraordinary things. Few windows showed lights, and from scarcely a single chimney came smoke or sparks. Shorthouse had already begun to notice everything, even the smallest details. Presently they stopped at the street corner and looked up at the name on the side of the house, full in the moonlight, and with one accord, but without remark, turned into the square and crossed over to the side of it that lay in shadow. "The number of the house is 13. Whispered a voice at his side. Neither of them made the obvious reference, but they passed across the broad sheet of moonlight and began to march up the pavement in silence. It was about halfway up the square that Shorthouse felt an arm slipped quietly but significantly into his own, and knew then that their adventure had begun in earnest, and that his companion was already yielding imperceptibly to the influences against them. She needed support. A few minutes later they stopped before a tall narrow house that rose before them into the night, ugly in shape and painted a dingy white. Shutterless windows without blinds stared down upon them, shining here and there in the moonlight. There were weather streaks in the wall and cracks in the paint, and the balcony bulged out from the first floor a little unnaturally. But beyond this generally forlorn appearance of an unoccupied house, there was nothing at first sight to single out this particular mansion for the evil character it had most certainly acquired. Taking a look over their shoulders to make sure they had not been followed, they went boldly up the steps and stood against the huge black door that fronted them forbiddingly. But the first wave of nervousness was now upon them, and Shorthouse fumbled a long time with the key before he could fit it into the lock at all. For a moment, if truth were told, they both hoped it would not open, for they were a prey to various unpleasant emotions as they stood there on the threshold of their ghostly adventure. Shorthouse, shuffling with the key and hampered by the steady weight on his arm, certainly felt the solemnity of the moment. It was as if the whole world, for all experience, seemed at that instant concentrated in his own consciousness, were listening to the grating noise of that key. A stray puff of wind wandering down the empty street woke a momentary rustling in the trees behind them, but otherwise this rattling of the key was the only sound audible. And at last it turned in the lock, and the heavy door swung open and revealed a yawning gulf of darkness beyond. With a last glance at the moonlit square, they passed quickly in, and the door slammed behind them with a roar that echoed prodigiously through empty halls and passages. But instantly, with the echoes, another sound made itself heard, and Aunt Julia leaned suddenly so heavily upon him that he had to take a step backwards to save himself from falling. A man had coughed close beside them, so close that it seemed they must have been actually by his side in the darkness. With the possibility of practical jokes in his mind, Shorthouse at once swung his heavy stick in the direction of the sound, but it met nothing more solid than air. He heard his aunt give a little gasp beside him. "There's someone here," she whispered. "I heard him." "Be quiet," he said sternly. "It was nothing but the noise of the front door." "Oh, get a light, quick," she added as her nephew, fumbling with a box of matches, opened it upside down and let them all fall with a rattle onto the stone floor. The sound, however, was not repeated, and there was no evidence of retreating footsteps. In another minute they had a candle burning, using an empty end of a cigar case as a holder, and when the first flare had died down, he held the impromptu lamp aloft and surveyed the scene. And it was dreary enough in all conscience, for there is nothing more desolate in all the abodes of men than an unfurnished house, dimly lit, silent and forsaken, and yet tenanted by rumour with the memories of evil and violent histories. They were standing in a wide hallway. On their left was the open door of a spacious dining room, and in front the hall ran, ever narrowing, into a long dark passage that led, apparently, to the top of the kitchen stairs. The broad uncarpeted staircase rose in a sweep before them, everywhere draped in shadows, except for a single spot about halfway up, where the moonlight came in through the window and fell on a bright patch on the boards. This shaft of light shed a faint radiance above and below it, lending to the objects within its reach a misty outline that was infinitely more suggestive and ghostly than complete darkness. Filtered moonlight always seems to paint faces on the surrounding gloom, and as Shorthouse peered up into the well of darkness and thought of the countless empty rooms and passages in the upper part of the old house, he caught himself longing again for the safety of the moonlit square, or the cosy, bright drawing room they had left an hour before. Then, realizing that these thoughts were dangerous, he thrust them away again and summoned all his energy for concentration on the present. "Aunt Julia," he said aloud severely, "we must now go through the house from top to bottom and make a thorough search." The echoes of his voice died away slowly all over the building, and in the intense silence that followed, he turned to look at her. In the candlelight he saw that her face was already ghastly pale, but she dropped his arm for a moment and said in a whisper, stepping close in front of him, "I agree, we must be sure there's no one hiding. That's the first thing." She spoke with evident effort, and he looked at her with admiration. "You feel quite sure of yourself? It's not too late." "I think so," she whispered, her eyes shifting nervously towards the shadows behind. "Quite sure, only one thing." "What's that?" "You must never leave me alone for an instant. As long as you understand that any sound or appearance must be investigated at once, for to hesitate means to admit fear. That is fatal." "Agreed," she said a little shakily after a moment's hesitation. "I'll try." Arm in arm, Shorthouse holding the dripping candle and the stick, while his aunt carried the cloak over her shoulders, figures of utter comedy to all but themselves, they began a systematic search. Stealthily walking on tiptoe and shading the candle lest it should betray their presence through the shutterless windows, they went first into the big dining room. There was not a stick of furniture to be seen. Bare walls, ugly mantelpieces and empty grates stared at them. Everything, they felt, resented their intrusion, watching them, as it were, with veiled eyes. Whispers followed them. Shadows flitted noiselessly to right and left. Something seemed ever at their back, watching, waiting an opportunity to do them injury. There was the inevitable sense that operations which went on when the room was empty had been temporarily suspended till they were well out of the way again. The whole dark interior of the old building seemed to become a malignant presence that rose, warning them to desist and mind their own business. Every moment the strain on their nerves increased. Out of the gloomy dining room they passed through the large folding doors into a sort of library or smoking room, wrapped equally in silence, darkness and dust. And from this they regained the hall near the top of the back stairs. Here a pitch-black tunnel opened before them into the lower regions, and it must be confessed, they hesitated. But only for a minute. With the worst of the night still to come, it was essential to turn from nothing. Aunt Julia stumbled at the top step of the dark descent, ill-lit by the flickering candle, and even Shorthouse felt at least half the decision go out of his legs. "Come on," he said peremptorily, and his voice ran on and lost itself in the dark, empty spaces below. "I'm coming," she faltered, catching his arm with unnecessary violence. They went a little unsteadily down the stone steps, a cold, damp air meeting them in the face, close and malodorous. The kitchen, into which the stairs led along a narrow passage, was large, with a lofty ceiling. Several doors opened out of it, some into cupboards with empty jars still standing on the shelves, and others into horrible little ghostly back offices, each colder and less inviting than the last. Black beetles scurried over the floor, and once when they knocked against a deal table standing in a corner, something about the size of a cat jumped down with a rush and fled, scampering across the stone floor into the darkness. Everywhere there was a sense of recent occupation, an impression of sadness and gloom. Leaving the main kitchen, they next went towards the scullery. The door was standing ajar, and as they pushed it open to its full extent, Aunt Julia uttered a piercing scream, which she instantly tried to stifle by placing a hand over her mouth. For a second, Shorthouse stood stock still, catching his breath. He felt as if his spine had suddenly become hollow, and someone had filled it with particles of ice. Facing them, directly in their way between the doorposts, stood the figure of a woman. She had dishevelled hair and wildly staring eyes, and her face was terrified and white as death. She stood there motionless for the space of a single second. Then the candle flickered and she was gone utterly, and the door framed nothing but empty darkness. "Only the beastly jumping candlelight," he said quickly, in a voice that sounded like someone else's and was only half under control. "Come on, Aunt, there's nothing there." He dragged her forward. With a clattering of feet and a great appearance of boldness, they went on, but over his body the skin moved as if crawling ants covered it, and he knew by the weight on his arm that he was supplying the force of locomotion for two. The scullery was cold, bare and empty, more like a large prison cell than anything else. They went round it, tried the door into the yard and the windows, but found them all fastened securely. His aunt moved beside him like a person in a dream. Her eyes were tightly shut, and she seemed merely to follow the pressure of his arm. Her courage filled him with amazement. At the same time, he noticed that a certain odd change had come over her face, a change which somehow evaded his power of analysis. "There's nothing here, Auntie," he repeated aloud quickly. "Let's go upstairs and see the rest of the house. Then we'll choose a room to wait up in." She followed him obediently, keeping close to his side, and they locked the kitchen door behind them. It was a relief to get up again. In the hall there was more light than before, for the moon had travelled a little further down the stairs. Cautiously they began to go up into the dark vault of the upper house, the boards creaking under their weight. On the first floor they found the large double drawing rooms, a search of which revealed nothing. Here also was no sign of furniture or recent occupancy, nothing but dust, neglect and shadows. They opened the big folding doors between the front and back drawing rooms, came out again to the landing and went on upstairs. They had not gone up more than a dozen steps when they both simultaneously stopped to listen, looking into each other's eyes with a new apprehension across the flickering candle flame. From the room they had left hardly 10 seconds before came the sound of doors quietly closing. It was beyond all question. They heard the booming noise that accompanies the shutting of heavy doors, followed by the sharp catching of the latch. "We must go back and see," Shorthouse said briefly in a low tone, turning to go downstairs again. Somehow she managed to drag after him, her feet catching in her dress, her face livid. When they entered the front drawing room, it was plain that the folding doors had been closed half a minute before. Without hesitation, Shorthouse opened them. He almost expected to see someone facing him in the back room, but only darkness and cold air met him. They went through both rooms, finding nothing unusual. They tried in every way to make the doors close of themselves, but there was not wind enough even to set the candle flame flickering. The doors would not move without strong pressure. All was silent as the grave. Undeniably, the rooms were utterly empty, and the house utterly still. "It's beginning," whispered a voice at his elbow, which he hardly recognized as his aunt's. He nodded acquiescence, taking out his watch to note the time. It was 15 minutes before midnight. He made the entry of exactly what had occurred in his notebook, setting the candle in its case upon the floor in order to do so. It took a moment or two to balance it safely against the wall. Aunt Julia always declared that at this moment she was not actually watching him, but had turned her head towards the inner room, where she fancied she heard something moving. But at any rate, both positively agreed that there came a sound of rushing feet, heavy and very swift, and the next instant the candle was out. But to Shorthouse himself had come more than this, and he has always thanked his fortunate stars that it came to him alone, and not to his aunt too. For as he rose from the stooping position of balancing the candle, and before it was actually extinguished, a face thrust itself forward so close to his own that he could almost have touched it with his lips. It was a face working with passion, a man's face, dark with thick features and angry savage eyes. It belonged to a common man, and it was evil in its ordinary normal expression, no doubt, but as he saw it, alive with intense aggressive emotion, it was a malignant and terrible human countenance. There was no movement of the air, nothing but the sound of rushing feet, stockinged or muffled feet, the apparition of the face, and the almost simultaneous extinguishing of the candle. In spite of himself, Shorthouse uttered a little cry, nearly losing his balance, as his aunt clung to him with her whole weight in one moment of real, uncontrollable terror. She made no sound, but simply seized him bodily. Fortunately, however, she had seen nothing but had only heard the rushing feet, for her control returned almost at once, and he was able to disentangle himself and strike a match. The shadows ran away on all sides before the glare, and his aunt stooped down and groped for the cigar case with the precious candle. Then they discovered that the candle had not been blown out at all. It had been crushed out. The wick was pressed down into the wax, which was flattened as if by some smooth, heavy instrument. How his companion so quickly overcame her terror, Shorthouse never properly understood, but his admiration for her self-control increased tenfold, and at the same time served to feed his own dying flame, for which he was undeniably grateful. Equally inexplicable to him was the evidence of physical force they had just witnessed. He at once suppressed the memory of stories he had heard of physical mediums and their dangerous phenomena, for if these were true, and either his aunt or himself was unwittingly a physical medium, it meant that they were simply aiding to focus the forces of a haunted house already charged to the brim. It was like walking with unprotected lamps among uncovered stores of gunpowder. So with as little reflection as possible, he simply relit the candle and went up to the next floor. The arm in his trembled, it is true, and his own tread was often uncertain, but they went on with thoroughness, and after a search revealing nothing, they climbed the last flight of stairs to the top floor of all. Here they found a perfect nest of small servants' rooms, with broken pieces of furniture, dirty cane-bottomed chairs, chests of drawers, cracked mirrors, and decrepit bedsteads. The rooms had low sloping ceilings already hung here and there with cobwebs, small windows, and badly plastered walls, a depressing and dismal region which they were glad to leave behind. It was on the stroke of midnight when they entered a small room on the third floor, close to the top of the stairs, and arranged to make themselves comfortable for the remainder of their adventure. It was absolutely bare, and was said to be the room then used as the clothes closet, into which the infuriated groom had chased his victim and finally caught her. Outside, across the narrow landing, began the stairs leading up to the floor above, and the servants' quarters where they had just searched. In spite of the chilliness of the night, there was something in the air of this room that cried for an open window. But there was more than this. Shorthouse could only describe it by saying that he felt less master of himself here than in any other part of the house. There was something that acted directly on the nerves, tiring the resolution, enfeebling the will. He was conscious of this result before he had been in the room 5 minutes, and it was in the short time they stayed there that he suffered the wholesale depletion of his vital forces, which was, for himself, the chief horror of the whole experience. They put the candle on the floor of the cupboard, leaving the door a few inches ajar so that there was no glare to confuse the eyes, and no shadow to shift about on walls and ceiling. Then they spread the cloak on the floor and sat down to wait, with their backs against the wall. Shorthouse was within 2 feet of the door onto the landing. His position commanded a good view of the main staircase leading down into the darkness, and also of the beginning of the servants' stairs, going to the floor above. The heavy stick lay beside him within easy reach. The moon was now high above the house. Through the open window they could see the comforting stars like friendly eyes watching in the sky. One by one the clocks of the town struck midnight, and when the sounds died away, the deep silence of a windless night fell again over everything. Only the boom of the sea, far away and lugubrious, filled the air with hollow murmurs. Inside the house the silence became awful. Awful, he thought, because any minute now it might be broken by sounds portending terror. The strain of waiting told more and more severely on the nerves. They talked in whispers when they talked at all, for their voices aloud sounded queer and unnatural. A chilliness, not altogether due to the night air, invaded the room and made them cold. The influences against them, whatever these might be, were slowly robbing them of self-confidence and the power of decisive action. Their forces were on the wane, and the possibility of real fear took on a new and terrible meaning. He began to tremble for the elderly woman by his side, whose pluck could hardly save her beyond a certain extent. He heard the blood singing in his veins. It sometimes seemed so loud that he fancied it prevented his hearing properly certain other sounds that were beginning very faintly to make themselves audible in the depths of the house. Every time he fastened his attention on these sounds, they instantly ceased. They certainly came no nearer. Yet he could not rid himself of the idea that the movement was going on somewhere in the lower regions of the house. The drawing-room floor, where the doors had been so strangely closed, seemed too near. The sounds were further off than that. He thought of the great kitchen, with the scurrying black beetles, and of the dismal little scullery. But somehow or other they did not seem to come from there either. Surely they were not outside the house. Then suddenly the truth flashed into his mind, and for the space of a minute he felt as if his blood had stopped flowing and turned to ice. The sounds were not downstairs at all. They were upstairs somewhere among those horrid, gloomy little servants' rooms, with their bits of broken furniture, low ceilings, and cramped windows. Upstairs, where the victim had first been disturbed and stalked to her death. And the moment he discovered where the sounds were, he began to hear them more clearly. It was the sound of feet moving stealthily along the passage overhead, in and out among the rooms and past the furniture. He turned quickly to steal a glance at the motionless figure seated beside him, to note whether she had shared his discovery. The faint candlelight coming through the crack in the cupboard door threw her strongly marked face into vivid relief against the white of the wall. But it was something else that made him catch his breath and stare again. An extraordinary something had come into her face and seemed to spread over her features like a mask. It smoothed out the deep lines and drew the skin everywhere a little tighter so that the wrinkles disappeared. It brought into the face, with the sole exception of the old eyes, an appearance of youth and almost of childhood. He stared in speechless amazement that was dangerously near to horror. It was his aunt's face indeed, but it was her face of 40 years ago, the vacant, innocent face of a girl. He had heard stories of that strange effect of terror which could wipe a human countenance clean of other emotions, obliterating all previous expressions, but he had never realized that it could be literally true or could mean anything so simply horrible as what he now saw. For the dreadful signature of overmastering fear was written plainly in that utter vacancy of the girlish face beside him, and when, feeling his intense gaze, she turned to look at him, he instinctively closed his eyes tightly to shut out the sight. Yet, when he turned a minute later, his feelings well in hand, he saw to his intense relief another expression. His aunt was smiling, and though the face was deathly white, the awful veil had lifted, and the normal look was returning. "Is anything wrong?" was all he could think of to say at the moment, and the answer was eloquent, coming from such a woman. "I feel cold and a little frightened," she whispered. He offered to close the window, but she seized hold of him and begged him not to leave her side even for an instant. "It's upstairs, I know," she whispered with an odd half laugh, "but I can't possibly go up." But Shorthouse thought otherwise, knowing that in action lay their best hope of self-control. He took the brandy flask and poured out a glass of neat spirit stiff enough to help anybody over anything. She swallowed it with a little shiver. His only idea now was to get out of the house before a collapse became inevitable, but this could not safely be done by turning tail and running from the enemy. Inaction was no longer possible. Every minute he was growing less master of himself, and desperate, aggressive measures were imperative without further delay. Moreover, the action must be taken towards the enemy, not away from it. The climax, if necessary and unavoidable, would have to be faced boldly. He could do it now, but in 10 minutes he might not have the force left to act for himself, much less for both. Upstairs, the sounds were meanwhile becoming louder and closer, accompanied by occasional creaking of the boards. Someone was moving stealthily about, stumbling now and then awkwardly against the furniture. Waiting a few moments to allow the tremendous dose of spirits to produce its effect, and knowing this would last but a short time under the circumstances, Shorthouse then quietly got on his feet, saying in a determined voice, "Now, Aunt Julia, we'll go upstairs and find out what all this noise is about. You must come too, it's what we agreed." He picked up his stick and went to the cupboard for the candle. A limp form rose shakily beside him, breathing hard, and he heard a voice say very faintly something about being ready to come. The woman's courage amazed him. It was so much greater than his own, and as they advanced, holding aloft the dripping candle, some subtle force exhaled from this trembling, white-faced old woman at his side that was the true source of his inspiration. It held something really great that shamed him and gave him the support without which he would have proved far less equal to the occasion. They crossed the dark landing, avoiding with their eyes the deep black space over the banisters. Then they began to mount the narrow staircase to meet the sounds which, minute by minute, grew louder and nearer. About halfway up the stairs, Aunt Julia stumbled and Shorthouse turned to catch her by the arm, and just at that moment there came a terrific crash in the servants' corridor overhead. It was instantly followed by a shrill, agonized scream that was a cry of terror, and a cry for help melted into one. Before they could move aside or go down a single step, someone came rushing along the passage overhead, blundering horribly, racing madly at full speed, 3 steps at a time, down the very staircase where they stood. The steps were light and uncertain, but close behind them sounded the heavier tread of another person, and the staircase seemed to shake. Shorthouse and his companion just had time to flatten themselves against the wall when the jumble of flying steps was upon them, and two persons, with the slightest possible interval between them, dashed past at full speed. It was a perfect whirlwind of sound breaking in upon the midnight silence of the empty building. The two runners, pursuer and pursued, had passed clean through them where they stood, and already with a thud the boards below had received first one, then the other. Yet they had seen absolutely nothing, not a hand or arm or face or even a shred of flying clothing. There came a second's pause. Then the first one, the lighter of the two, obviously the pursued one, ran with uncertain footsteps into the little room which Shorthouse and his aunt had just left. The heavier one followed. There was a sound of scuffling, gasping and smothered screaming, and then out onto the landing came the step of a single person treading weightily. A dead silence followed for the space of half a minute, and then was heard a rushing sound through the air. It was followed by a dull, crashing thud in the depths of the house below, on the stone floor of the hall. Utter silence reigned after. Nothing moved. The flame of the candle was steady. It had been steady the whole time, and the air had been undisturbed by any movement whatsoever. Palsied with terror, Aunt Julia, without waiting for her companion, began fumbling her way downstairs. She was crying gently to herself, and when Shorthouse put his arm around her and half carried her, he felt that she was trembling like a leaf. He went into the little room and picked up the cloak from the floor, and arm in arm, walking very slowly without speaking a word or looking once behind them, they marched down the 3 flights into the hall. In the hall they saw nothing, but the whole way down the stairs they were conscious that someone followed them, step by step. When they went faster, it was left behind, and when they went more slowly, it caught them up. But never once did they look behind to see, and at each turning of the staircase they lowered their eyes for fear of the following horror they might see upon the stairs above. With trembling hands Shorthouse opened the front door, and they walked out into the moonlight and drew a deep breath of the cool night air blowing in from the sea. The end.